Another beautiful day in Eorzea. Let's see what Mentor Roulette has in store today. Oh, Aurum Vale. And it looks like it's the tank's first time. Well, it'll be okay. Just gotta give him a little word of caution. Hi there, newcomer. I can see you haven't tanked this dungeon before. The first room can be really tricky. There are a lot of monsters in there that can pile up really easily. So what we can do is just move along the wall and... Wait! Don't go into the middle of the...
Well, he pulled. Guess I'll come and help.
Just another day in Aurum Vale. This pull could have been handled better.
Where were the heals?
Okay, I could have tried to heal that pull.
Glare Mage.
But even the best healers can't heal a poorly planned encounter. It might be the healer's job to keep the tanks alive, but it's the tank's job to use their defenses effectively to give the healer a little help. A tank who pulls every enemy in the room and doesn't use any defensive abilities might as well have come to the fight in nothing more than his underwear. Then the DPS will die, and finally the healer. Pulling mobs without a plan, especially in a uniquely tricky dungeon like Aurum Vale, isn't the most effective strategy. But thinking ahead and planning your mitigations will allow even a brand new sprout to lead their party to victory. Hi, my name is Zivalene, and I'll be your battle mentor for this lecture. Let us begin, shall we, class? This is Tanking 101 for Sprouts. So, you've taken the plunge and decided to begin your adventure into tanking in Final Fantasy XIV. If you're a new adventurer in the game, or you have little experience in the playstyle of tanking, allow me to give you the basic introduction, some instruction, and maybe a few tips to help you along your journey. A tank in MMOs is typically a character, class, or build that generally has a higher health point value than other classes, and has a superior defense stat. Put a high defense stat together with a high HP, and you are more difficult to kill in combat against enemies. Examples of this in other multiplayer games are the Juggernaut in SWTOR, Paladin in WoW, and Reinhardt in Overwatch. Your armor is thick, and it will take more than a few hits to take you down. Thus, these characters are known as tanks. As a tank, it is your responsibility to keep your teammates safe from oncoming damage, to allow them to continue to do their own respective duties unimpeded without impending fear of death. Tanks also have the ability to lower the amount of damage teammates take when it's inevitable, also called mitigating damage. In Final Fantasy XIV, this is the basic outline of your role as one of the, as the time of this video was published, 4 tanks available in the game. However, not all these tanks are created equal. Some have lower defense stats, some have higher magical defense stats, and some deal higher DPS than others. If you're a brand new player to Final Fantasy XIV, then you will decide between 2 classes, Marauder or Gladiator. These are available from the character creation screen and can be attained otherwise at level 10 or above if you start as another class. These will eventually become Warrior or Paladin. Once you reach Heaven's Ward, you can unlock Dark Knight, which starts at level 30. Those who have purchased the full game can unlock Gunbreaker and Gridania upon reaching level 60. Of these, I would highly suggest new tanks to start with Warrior or Paladin, as they start at level 1 and gradually introduce you to the basics of the tank role as you ascend to the level cap. Conversely, Dark Knight and Gunbreaker start with a partially complete kit and each have their unique mechanics ready from go, meaning you would be simultaneously learning the fundamentals of tanking alongside their individual playstyles. And trust me, you don't want to be that guy that buys a skip for Warrior and the story so that you can play Gunbreaker without progging. Then you'll start the new expansion with no clue what's going on in the story, you'll get into the first dungeon and have no idea what you're doing, and probably die constantly, and your party will hate you, and probably kick you. It ain't worth $80 to $120 for that. Instead, take it slow. Trust me, little sprout, the rush to get to the end game and raid with your friends isn't worth everything you'd miss out on. In this game, the destination is worth the journey. Anyway, enough lecturing in the middle of the lecture. Let's talk about the basics of tanking, the universal rules no matter which class you choose. As a tank, there are some commonalities in the role that will be consistent regardless which tank you're playing as. The first is that your job in the group is to be the center of attention, so that the enemies pummel you, but not your teammates. To do this, you'll activate your enmity generating ability, or tank stance as we call it. This will either be Iron Will, Defiance, Grit, or Royal Guard. Keep this on at all times, except in certain circumstances when you are grouped with another tank. Having this enabled means that your attacks generate more enmity than the DPS or healers do, and the mobs you damage will focus on you instead. If you forget to turn it on, the enemies will instead start to rip your party to shreds, and your chat will inevitably be filled with the phrase,
Stance? Stance?
Please, for the love of God, turn on your tank stance.
Instance on you moped.
in dungeons and duties where you are the solo tank. This should never be off. Not sure if you have it on or off? Take a look at your buff bar. If you see the symbol that matches your class's tank stance, you're good to start the pull. It'll also show up next to your name in the party list. If you don't see it, just push the button. 1 off global cooldown is a small price to pay compared to the potential death of your party. And your team will thank you too. So now you know what button to push to generate enmity. But what button should you actually be pressing in combat? Well, in order to keep your enmity, you need to give the enemies a reason to keep hating you more than the bard singing Despacito in the corner of the room. Meaning, you're gonna have to fight. I know. Actually play the game. Who would have thought it? Every tank has a series of attacks that line up with each other to form a combo. These are 3 single target attacks that deal damage and, when performed in the correct order, light up and deal even more damage. We call them 1-2-3s. Yeah, we got really creative with that one. The idea in a fight is simple. Use your attacks to reduce the enemy's HP to 0 before yours goes down to 0. Just keep hitting your 1-2-3s, and it'll go down in a few swings of your weapon. But I hear you ask, Ziv, there's a bunch of enemies in front of me. It'll take forever for me to pick them all up before they kill my dancer twerking in the middle of the crowd. Alas, dear novice, there's a solution to that. Every tank has 2 abilities called AoE attacks, or area of effect attacks. Simply run into the group of enemies and spam those to your heart's content. They may do less damage, but attacking all your enemies rather than one at a time is what makes up for it. And if you recall, I said there were 2 such abilities for each tank, because each one is a 2-part combo ability. Consider this as a 1-2 punch, as opposed to a 1-2-3. In combat, there is an enemy list which denotes which enemies you are engaged with. If an enemy is targeting you, it will have a red icon next to their name. As a tank, red is good. Red means you have the enemy's full attention. If the icon beside an enemy is green, it means they don't even know you exist, and would much rather lay on a bed full of nails with an anvil in their chest rather than acknowledging you. This enemy is attacking one of your other party members, and they have full enmity. In order to turn it red, just attack that enemy to get them back to hating your guts. If you notice the icon is yellow or orange, it means you have partial enmity, and your teammates are simply doing more damage or healing than you, and are becoming priority targets. Yellow or orange is usually a good sign to poke that enemy in particular to get him to pay attention to you. In the case that this enemy is attacking your black mage off in Narnia, each tank has a ranged attack that also has the extra perk of increasing enmity more than your other moves. Use this when an enemy is out of your attack range to pick them up. Now that we've talked about attacks, let's cover the general tank abilities that increase your defense. All tanks have 2 common abilities, Rampart and Reprisal. Rampart increases your own defense for 20 seconds. Reprisal reduces the enemy's attack stat for 10 seconds. And this can affect multiple targets. Another more niche ability is Arm's Length. This ability will slow the attack speed of an enemy for 15 seconds, meaning you will take fewer attacks from any enemies that hit you for a short period of time. Using these in combat will greatly increase your survivability, but don't think that you can just press all 3 buttons and you're immune to death. All these abilities are subject to cooldown, a period of time where your ability cannot be used again until its timer reaches 0. In order to make best use of your defensive abilities, or mitigations, you'll want to space them out throughout the fight. The longer an encounter goes on, the more you'll want to consider which abilities will work best for certain points in the fight. Using these abilities means your HP won't depreciate too quickly in a fight, and gives the healer a better chance of keeping you alive. Now, just because you're a tank and you can take a few hits, doesn't mean you have to take every hit. In fact, taking every hit will most certainly make your healer hate you. You see, enemies don't just auto-attack you constantly. Some attacks are completely avoidable, and if you do end up getting hit, they will hurt a lot more than the generic attacks. These attacks are usually telegraphed by an orange shape radiating from the enemy. These can be circles, cones, bow ties, and even donuts, and a lot more that I didn't just list. Just stand outside these orange telegraphs, and you'll avoid the attack when the enemy's cast bar completes. Since I've mentioned telegraphed attacks, it's probably best that I point out that some of these attacks are specifically targeting you, meaning wherever you're standing, everyone around you would need to dodge it as well. In the interest of keeping your party members safe and your melee DPS happy, you'll want to stand on the opposite side of the mobs. Since enemies will face you to attack you, you'll want to ensure that their backs are to your party to keep them safe from wayward telegraphed AoEs, and to give them an easier time in attacking their weak points. Let's see, is there anything I've left out before we move on to demonstrations? Ah, my own raid mentor has graced us with his presence. Oh, great bun of the lotus, what is your wisdom for these sprouts? Yeah, I guess I should mention Tankbusters. Tankbusters are extremely powerful attacks that can one-shot anyone in the party, except for a tank using defensive cooldowns. To make it even worse, some Tankbusters can be AoEs, so it's doubly important that you have your tank stance on, and that you aren't standing with your party. My raid mentor has plenty of experience with being on the wrong side of a Tankbuster when a tank dies, and so have I. In earlier stages of the game, most Tankbusters won't be inherently lethal to tanks. Recently, Tankbusters have been given red circular markers that surround the tank. When you see this, use a mitigation and be sure you're away from the party. And don't worry about constantly being on edge about these. They only appear on bosses and raids, so common trash mobs won't be using these. Now that we know the basic fundamentals of tanking, let's walk through a general example of a combat encounter in a dungeon. Coming across a group of enemies, you, as the tank, with your tank stance enabled, will approach the crowd and use your AoE attack to gain enmity across the board and keep your allies safe. As the fight has just begun, you can use Rampart or Reprisal to reduce the amount of damage you take, while the healer pops a regen or a shield on you. The DPS begin to whittle down the enemy's HP. Rinse and repeat your AoE attacks and your foes shall fall. While I say that this is a general example, this is the most basic pull we can do. Most commonly, parties in dungeons will want for the tank to pull multiple groups of enemies until you can no longer progress and you are required to defeat all enemies to proceed. These are called wall-to-wall pulls, or just simply big pulls. Big pulls are effective when you want to get through a dungeon quickly, which admittedly is most of the time. You're either there to proceed to the next major story beat, or you're completing a dungeon for the 20th time as part of your daily roulette. These pulls require a concerted effort between all 4 party members. The tank is taking a huge barrage of damage for a lengthy period of time, which means you must use your mitigations wisely, and don't use them all at once. Otherwise, you'll run out of steam halfway through the encounter, and all you can do is watch your HP plummet. Healers will be using a majority of their kit to keep you alive, but not even the best healers can keep an unmitigated tank alive during a big pull. DPS must be using their AoE abilities and high potency abilities effectively to be dealing enough damage to end the fight before the tank and the healer run out of abilities to use. But when done well, dungeons can be completed in half the time it would take doing one pull at a time. Regardless, don't feel obligated to do big pulls if you aren't comfortable with your class or the dungeon. Big pulls require a concerted effort among all 4 party members to pull off. If you aren't ready for big pulls, let your team know at the start of the dungeon that you'll be taking it slow. This goes for new healers as well. If your healer isn't confident that they can keep you alive in a big pull, don't overdo it. Respect each other and work together, and you'll reach the end of the dungeon in due time. Let's see an example of a wall-to-wall pull in a dungeon. Before the pull, the healer will cast a regen or shield on the tank. The tank will pop sprint and lead the way into the first group and pick them all up with an AoE or 2. Once all the enemies in the group show as red in the enemy list, the tank will make their way to the next pull. You'll be taking residual damage from the enemies that are keeping up with you, but your healer should have you covered during this pickup phase. Most big pulls consist of 2 groups, meaning you'll be standing your ground here. If there is a 3rd group to collect, use AoEs on these mobs to grab Enmity, then keep moving. Once you reach a dead end, it's time for the real fight. Your healer will be doing all they can to keep you alive, so you'll need to pay them back in kind to make it through. As all the enemies gather, use Reprisal to lower all their damage output. Then use Arm's Length to slow them down even further. Depending on what tank you're playing as, use your short cooldown ability as Reprisal falls off, and combine that with Rampart. Remember, the best time to use your mitigations is at the beginning of the fight, when your HP is taking the hardest beating. Once a few enemies have been defeated, you can cut back to 1 defensive cooldown to finish the fight. However, not all pulls are so straightforward as kill enemies and live. Sometimes, there will be enemies present that can raise the difficulty of the encounter, such as an enemy that buffs allies if you don't stop it from casting an ability, enemies that can summon more allies and needs to be focused down, or enemies that ignore enmity and attack whoever they want and need to be prioritized. There are also cases where some dungeons have designs in the map that you can exploit to your advantage. Let's go all the way back to our example at the beginning of the video from Aurum Vale. What makes this first room difficult is that there are yellow puddles on the ground that deal damage to anyone standing in them. The toad enemies that can pull players close to it, and also shove players away with its jump. And the wasp enemies attack from afar and tend to stay out of your range as they whittle down your HP. These enemies also wander, so it's very easy to attract more attention than you want. Let's also mention that there are vents on the walls that push you towards the center. At this level, most tanks don't have their best mitigations or invulns. Healers have limited heals, so larger erratic pulls like this have low likelihood of succeeding. Instead, we take a more strategic approach. As you enter the room, you're able to walk along the left wall. Carefully avoid the puddles and the vents. You'll pull the nearest wasp and toad and take care of them with your back against the wall, meaning any knockbacks won't place you in a dangerous position. Once they're down, pull the 2 wasps patrolling further along the wall. Duck behind the rocks so that you're out of their line of sight, forcing them to come to you and away from the second toad. With them out of the way, it's just a matter of waiting for the all clear to run into the boss room. As you can see, there's more than one way to approach an encounter. As the tank, you're the one that gets to decide the flow of the duty. It seems like a lot of responsibility, but the only way to learn is to throw yourself in there and try. If you have friends or an FC, ask if someone would be willing to be your healer as you start out if you're prone to tanxiety. Having someone you trust as a healer can take the edge off of playing with randoms. If you do go in solo, let those who have issues with your growing pains go in one ear and out the other. Everyone has to start somewhere. Even adventurers that have been playing the game for a long time can feel inadequate when trying to do a new job or role, so don't give up. Now that we've covered the basics of tanking and what your responsibilities are in a fight, I suppose you'd like to know which tank is best for you. Well, I'll start out by telling you that classes undergo periodic and occasional changes as the game is patched and developed. Over the years, some classes have undergone heavy changes and hardly resemble what they did a few years ago. As of this video's posting, we know that the dev team is intending on reworking Paladin, so my description may not be accurate based on how far into the future you're watching this. Again, if you're brand new to Final Fantasy XIV, I would highly suggest starting as Marauder or Gladiator. These are like training wheels when learning how to tank, since they are starting classes and have comparably easier mechanics. Once Marauder becomes Warrior, your kit will develop as a tank that focuses on building a meter that allows you to use high-potency attacks, and your mitigations include several effective self-healing effects. You'll eventually get an ability called Shake It Off, which can shield yourself and your teammates at the cost of spending your other mitigations to empower it. Warriors are generally a highly independent tank, and I have witnessed a tank solo several end-of-dungeon bosses. They are very useful in dungeon scenarios and are decent when it comes to boss fights with their invulnerability Holmgang, having the fastest cooldown of any of the tanks. If you choose Gladiator, you'll eventually become a Paladin. Paladins have low DPS output for a tank, but have several abilities to keep themselves alive. Their meter is spent to use mitigating abilities, including a very quick defensive cooldown called Sheltron. You can also spend your meter to reduce damage given to a party member, or take the entirety of the damage they would have sustained in their place. Use this with caution, as using it in the wrong attack can easily kill you. In later levels, you'll be casting spells and spending magic points to attack from afar. Above level 80, your spells and Sheltron will heal you, giving you more independence than most tanks, but not quite as much as Warrior. Since you carry a shield, you have a higher chance to automatically reduce incoming damage by blocking attacks. Paladin's Invuln, Hollowed Ground, makes you completely impervious to damage for 10 seconds. The catch is that it has the longest cooldown of any tank, so this is best used sparingly. Once you reach Heaven's Ward, you can unlock Dark Knight at level 30. Dark Knight is a damage-oriented tank with a fair amount of magical damage reduction. Their kit involves spending magic points and the Darkness Gauge to deal heavy damage to enemies with a wide range of abilities. Your Blackest Night ability allows you to place a shield on yourself or a party member that, when depleted, gives you a free attack that would otherwise expend magic points. At higher levels, you'll be able to summon a shadow of yourself to fight alongside you. Dark Knight, as of this video's posting, is the highest damage dealing tank in the game and has a loose rotation that is mostly just cramming all your attacks into a 20-second window. When dealing with single targets, like bosses however, Dark Knight has the least effective healing abilities in the job role. Dark Knight comes with a bit of a risk, however. Should you choose to decide to use your Living Dead invulnerability, your healer must top off your health once you die, or your feigned death will turn into actual death after 10 seconds. If they do succeed in healing you, then you basically become Warrior for the next 10 seconds and every attack you do will heal you. I recommend making a macro for this when you use Living Dead, so your healer can be ready to use their best heals for when it matters most. Finally, there's Gunbreaker, that you unlock at level 60 in Gridania. Gunbreaker is a damage-oriented tank with the lowest defense stat of all the tanks. They are a glass cannon, but not quite as powerful as Dark Knight. Gunbreakers make use of cartridges they store upon completing their basic combo. These cartridges are spent on high-potency moves, including a string of attacks that deal heavy damage. Gunbreaker has a fair balance of self and party mitigation, both physical and magical, and is also able to cast a regen on themselves and others. Their Invuln Super Bolide reduces your HP to 1, but makes you immune to damage for 10 seconds. This is another ability I would suggest adding a macro to, so your healer is aware that you just shot yourself in the face and need a band-aid. A secret to Super Bolide is that there is a small fraction of a second where your invulnerability doesn't kick in once you hit 1 HP. So there's a slight risk of outright committing Sudoku if any of the enemy's attacks land in that tiny window. And there you have it! I hope you learned something about tanking from this video today. If you did, leave a like and subscribe for more Final Fantasy XIV content. If there's something you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments section along with your favorite tank, and some of your experiences on your adventures. Until next time!